Even if she wanted to refuse, the protocol of the monarchy left Camilla with no choice but to step up to the podium to deliver her speech. But what the world will remember is not the grandeur of the speech, it's the million-dollar stumble that followed. Under the cold, unwavering gaze of dozens of courtiers and senior family members, after stumbling just before reaching the third step, Camilla, mortified and in deep shock, refused any help getting back up. She was likely in some pain, too. She kept asking, who drafted this? Who approved it? And when did Catherine agree to it? This was no mere accident of geography. It was the climax of an ambush that had been months in the making. Camilla had entered the room with the practiced ease of a woman who believed she was there to discuss the routine adjustment of King Charles's schedule. She had, as was her habit, arrived slightly later than the rest, expecting the room to wait for her, as it always had. But today, the atmosphere was frozen in a silence so thick it felt weighted. Every member of the royal family was already seated, their postures rigid, their expressions unreadable, their eyes fixed on the door. There was no warmth, no pleasantries, only the clinical, terrifying focus of a firing squad. As Camilla took her place, she was presented with a dossier that contained not a request for consultation, but a mandate for transition. Her reaction was a study in visceral reaction, a look of stunning shock that rapidly curdled into a cold, hard rage. It was the face of a woman who had spent decades fighting to be recognized, only to realize in a split second that her relevance was being systematically dismantled. The document laid out a structural shift that was absolute and calculated. This was not a temporary relief package for an overworked king. It was a total transfer of agency. Who drafted this? She demanded, her voice cutting through the silence like a blade. Who gave the approval? When did Catherine agree to this? Her questions were not merely those of a confused monarch. They were the desperate cries of a strategist trying to map the perimeter of her own demise. She was hunting for the architect of her exclusion. Was this the cold ambition of William, determined to carve out his own destiny? Or was it the ultimate betrayal, a quiet consensus reached by the very people she trusted most, including Charles himself? When she turned to the king, searching his face for a flicker of defense or an explanation that would soften the blow, she was met with a silence that spoke volumes. That silence was the final confirmation. Camilla realized in that heartbeat that the man she loved had not just failed to stop this process, he had sanctioned it. He had placed the survival of the institution above the sanctity of their partnership. The crown, which she had spent her life reaching for, had transformed instantly into a countdown clock. She was looking at the end of her own era, watching as the power she had sacrificed everything to hold was being surgically extracted and handed over to Catherine. The stumble on the stairs was merely the external echo of an internal collapse. She was no longer the centerpiece. She was, for all intents and purposes, a beautiful, gilded piece of furniture, a relic of a transitionary period being phased out by the very people who had once sworn to stand by her. The coup had not been fought with swords or scandals. It had been fought with agendas, schedules, and the devastating, crushing weight of institutional inevitability. The atmosphere within the room remained heavy with the gravity of the unfolding events, as Camilla attempted to regain her composure after the initial shock of the transition document. Her mind raced to comprehend how such a seismic shift in the architecture of the monarchy could have occurred behind her back. This was not merely an administrative reshuffling of royal duties. It was a calculated and deliberate erosion of her influence, a process that had clearly been orchestrated with precision and, perhaps most painfully, without her presence. The realization that the Prince and Princess of Wales had been working toward this outcome for weeks, while she remained entirely oblivious, left her feeling utterly isolated within her own palace. She stood there, still processing the weight of the document she had been forced to confront, searching for any sign that this was a misunderstanding. However, the icy resolve visible in the eyes of the other family members confirmed that this was a final and irreversible decree. William stood at the forefront of this movement, his posture reflecting the burden of the responsibility he had chosen to assume. He did not speak with malice, but his words carried the weight of an unavoidable necessity. For William, this was not about personal power, but about the long-term survival and relevance of the institution he would one day lead. He believed that the monarchy could no longer afford to operate on the whims of the present, nor could it rely on the status quo, when the expectations of the public were evolving at such a rapid pace. He spoke of the need for a structure that could withstand the pressures of the decades to come, emphasizing that Catherine had become the most effective representative of the family before the public eye. His rhetoric was clear, emphasizing that the future of the crown depended on their ability to act decisively, rather than waiting for crises to dictate their path forward. For Camilla, listening to these proclamations felt like witnessing her own slow erasure from the public narrative of the monarchy. She had spent 2,000 years in the shadow of historical scrutiny and public doubt, laboring to prove her worth and establish her position beside the king. To have that foundation pulled out from under her, and to have her role redefined as purely ceremonial while Catherine stepped into the center of the stage, was a devastating blow to her dignity. She felt the sting of being cast aside not because of failure, but because the institution she had served for so long had decided it had outgrown her. The irony was not lost on her, as she heard the arguments for efficiency and stability being used to justify the removal of her active authority. She had fought to be recognized as queen, only to find that the title itself might soon become a gilded cage, devoid of the very influence she had fought to obtain. The silence that followed William's declarations was, in its own way, more cutting than any explicit criticism. It was the silence of people who had already made up their minds and were simply waiting for the inevitable to play out. Catherine remained poised and calm throughout the proceedings, her presence acting as a constant reminder of the shift that was currently in motion. She did not engage in the emotional fray, but instead projected an aura of quiet confidence that only deepened the sense of exclusion Camilla felt. It was clear that Catherine had prepared herself for this role, and the fact that her name was now being attached to the major state visits and charity planning was the ultimate indicator of where the new center of gravity lay. Camilla looked at her daughter-in-law and saw not an adversary, but the living, breathing manifestation of the future that had been carved out in her absence. The cruelty of the situation lay in its sheer efficiency. There were no outbursts or dramatic confrontations that would allow Camilla to fight back in the court of public opinion. Instead, there was only the cold, clinical logic of a professional transition, one that left no room for sentimentality or historical context. As she stood in that room, Camilla realized that her struggle to overcome the past had only led her to a present where she was being forced into a decorative role, sidelined by the very family members she had once considered her allies. The pride she had taken in her work, the countless hours spent on public engagements, and the dedication she had shown to the king all seemed to be treated as relics of a previous, less efficient era. She stood on the precipice of a new reality, one where she was expected to be a participant in her own marginalization, all in the name of a future that she would no longer be allowed to shape. This was the silent, sterile, and entirely relentless nature of the new royal order that was now descending upon her. The intensity in the room deepened as the discussion shifted from abstract ideals of stability to the cold, hard reality of the new royal schedule. Camilla refused to let the moment pass without articulating the gravity of the transformation taking place before her eyes. She felt the heavy burden of her position, sensing that the very definition of her service was being hollowed out. She argued with a controlled but palpable intensity that the systematic reduction of her responsibilities would do more than just sideline her. It would inevitably undermine the perceived authority of the king himself. To the public, she contended, a monarchy that appeared to be actively pushing its queen into the background would look disjointed and precarious. She pressed the point that the reign of the king should not be viewed by the world as a mere waiting room for his son, yet the way these changes were being implemented seemed to suggest exactly that. The king remained largely passive, his demeanor reflecting the profound internal conflict of a man who understood the necessity of these measures yet felt the deep personal sting they inflicted upon his wife. Camilla looked at him, searching for the partner who had stood by her through years of public vitriol and private isolation. She saw only the monarch, a man burdened by the weight of a crown that required him to sacrifice personal comfort for institutional longevity. It was a harrowing realization for Camilla, as she recognized that the man she loved had effectively yielded the initiative to the Prince of Wales. The power dynamic had shifted irrevocably, and the king was no longer the sole architect of his own court. Every argument she raised was met with the dry, sterile counter-arguments of duty and the pragmatic requirements of a modern institution. William continued to articulate his vision with an unnerving degree of composure. He maintained that the Prince and Princess of Wales had to be front and center not because they sought personal fame, but because the institution required a modern, dynamic presence that could carry the monarchy through the next 3 decades. He spoke of charity commitments, international tours, and the delicate art of public perception, as if they were components of a logistical machine that needed optimization. For Camilla, this was the ultimate betrayal of the intangible, human element of the monarchy. She had always viewed her role as rooted in the personal connections she fostered and the empathy she provided, but William was redefining it as a matter of efficiency, visibility, and strategic placement. She felt her life's work being reduced to a series of bullet points on a transition chart. The presence of the Princess of Wales added a layer of profound discomfort to the proceedings. Catherine did not offer apologies or explanations for the changes, nor did she attempt to comfort the woman who was effectively losing her seat at the table. Instead, she embodied the very future that was rendering Camilla obsolete. Her focus was entirely forward, her demeanor was perfectly calibrated, and she displayed a quiet competence that made the case for her ascension appear not just logical, but necessary. Camilla watched her and realized that Catherine had been prepared for this moment with a level of rigor that she herself had never been afforded. It was a masterclass in controlled succession, executed with such precision that any protest Camilla might raise would seem like a petulant refusal to accept the inevitable. She turned back to the king once more, hoping to find a path back to relevance, but the atmosphere had reached a point of no return. Every word uttered by the family members in that room reinforced the conclusion that the decision had already been finalized in the quiet corridors of the palace before she had ever been invited to the table. She felt the walls closing in as she realized that her opposition was seen not as a valid concern for the integrity of the reign, but as an obstacle to be managed and bypassed. The pride she had cultivated in her position as queen, the resilience she had shown in the face of immense adversity, and the dedication she had given to the king all seemed to be dissolving under the relentless, sterile pressure of this new order. She had arrived at this meeting expecting to discuss a light administrative update and was instead watching the sunset of her own influence, powerless to stop the encroaching darkness of a future that had no place for her as a central figure. The tragedy of her position was absolute, as she stood there, the queen in name, while the power of the throne migrated steadily, and without apology to the generation that was already waiting to take it. The final, most devastating blow arrived not through an official decree or a loud proclamation, but in the quiet, clinical language of a proposed addendum to the royal agenda. Camilla stared at the page, her eyes scanning the lines that effectively relegated her to a phantom presence within the highest echelons of the palace. The document was thin, yet it held the weight of an entire era being dismantled. It did not speak of current schedules or temporary adjustments to workloads. It outlined the framework for future state banquets, Commonwealth gatherings, and the most prestigious diplomatic milestones, all structured around the Prince and Princess of Wales. Her role, where mentioned, was stripped of its strategic significance, described instead in the cold, hollow terminology of ritualistic presence. She realized then that her voice had been removed from the room before she even had the chance to raise it. The palace machine had been whirring in the background for months, drafting the blueprint of a future where she was at best a guest, and at worst, a decorative reminder of a bygone period. She reached for the document, her fingers trembling, only to find it pulled back by a senior aide. The official explained with detached professionalism that the document had not yet been approved. It was a phantom, a suggestion waiting for a signature that would finalize the transformation of her life's work. William had vetted every syllable. Catherine had meticulously reviewed the implications, ensuring that the transition would be seamless and that the public image of the monarchy would remain unblemished by the internal strife of its members. They had accounted for everything, from the optics of the charity events to the precise timing of the international tours, leaving no stone unturned in their pursuit of a monarchy that felt inherently theirs. The only thing missing was the final sanction from the king, the stroke of the pen that would convert this plan from a proposal into an immutable reality. The king remained in the room, isolated with the unassigned document after the others had been signaled to depart. And in that vacuum of silence, the full scope of his betrayal became clear. The king sat alone, the document resting before him like an altar to his own legacy. He had dreamed for his entire existence of this throne, of the ceremonies, the responsibilities, and the singular opportunity to define the trajectory of the institution he would lead. He had spent decades preparing for this specific moment, only to find that the very authority he had finally grasped was being redirected toward his son and daughter-in-law before he had even begun to breathe into his own reign. The pressure was suffocating. Every argument he had entertained during the meeting held weight, but the most painful of these was the realization that his own reign was being treated as a brief, transitional bridge. The logic was cold, the institution required certainty, and that certainty was being anchored in the future, not in the present. He understood that signing the document would not strip his wife of her title, nor would it diminish the truth of their marriage, but it would create a structure that no longer necessitated her presence at the heart of statecraft. When William eventually returned to the room, there was no need for grand, theatrical demands. His presence alone communicated the urgency of the moment. He spoke not of personal ambition, but of the existential danger of inertia. He detailed the months of planning required for state visits, the necessity of having stable, recognizable patrons for international charities, and the expectations of Commonwealth leaders who demanded clarity regarding who would stand for the crown in the coming decades. He argued that the monarchy could not afford to be reactive, waiting for the next inevitable crisis to expose their lack of preparation. He presented a vision of the future that felt entirely inevitable, a reality that the king had been trying to ignore. William maintained that the public had already made their choice, responding to Catherine with a warmth and trust that the institution could not afford to dismiss. His assessment was surgically precise, leaving the king with no intellectual defense against the reality of the situation. Camilla entered during the final moments of their exchange, her exhaustion and her fear no longer concealed behind a mask of regal indifference. She argued with a final, desperate fervor that reducing her role would do far more than simply inconvenience her. It would hollow out the symbolic power of the king himself. If the public perceived that the king was being surrounded and managed by a court that favored his son, his reign would become an object of pity rather than one of authority. She reminded them of the sanctity of hierarchy, arguing that a monarchy that allowed itself to be governed by the fickle tides of public popularity and social media approval was a monarchy that had already lost its soul. Her voice remained calm, but beneath the surface was the jagged reality of a woman who saw the life she had fought for being systematically stripped away. She looked at the king, hoping for the man she knew, but found instead the monarch who had already begun to turn away from her, to embrace the colder, more durable future that his son had laid out before him. The atmosphere reached a breaking point, a moment of profound, institutional silence where every choice carried the weight of historical permanence. The tension in the room thickened until it felt as though the very air was crystallized by the weight of unsaid truths. Charles stood at the head of the mahogany table, his movement slow and deliberate as he weighed the future of his own crown against the preservation of his personal sanctuary. He looked at Camilla, whose presence had been the singular anchor of his life through the most turbulent years of public scrutiny. He saw the fire in her eyes, the remnants of a woman who had refused to be silenced by critics or tradition, and who now found herself fighting a war against the very institution she had helped him secure. Charles turned toward his son, but his gaze did not hold the warmth of a father toward a child. Instead, it was the guarded, analytical look of a sovereign assessing the strength of a successor who was already governing in all but name. William did not blink. He stood firm, his stillness a testament to the reality that he had moved past the stage of consultation and into the realm of administration. The Princess Royal, Anne, remained in the corner of the room, acting as the silent witness to this collision of generations. She had not spoken for several minutes, allowing the tension to permeate every corner of the palace. When Charles finally spoke, his voice was thin, lacking the resonance of a king in command. He asked Anne if she believed that Camilla had become an obstacle to the continuity of the throne. The question hung in the air, vulnerable and exposed. Anne took a moment that felt like an eternity. She was a woman who had built her reputation on the bedrock of duty and the unflinching rejection of royal pageantry in favor of pure, undistilled service. She chose her words with the precision of a surgeon, knowing that whatever she said would alter the course of their history. She told the king that Camilla was not the obstacle, but that the fear of failing the monarchy was the true burden they all carried. Anne's advice was chilling in its practicality. She advised him to uphold the dignity of the queen, to retain the patronages that were most intimate to her history, and to always keep her by his side during the significant state occasions that demanded the appearance of a united front. But she made it clear that the machine of the future, the machinery that William and Catherine were preparing to operate, had to be allowed to move forward. It was not a judgment on Camilla's past performance, she insisted. It was a cold, mathematical calculation of time. The monarchy was a vessel that required captains capable of holding the wheel for the next 30 years. That was the domain of William and Catherine. She warned that delay would only lead to a harsher, more public reckoning, one that would force the hand of the palace under the gaze of a world that would not wait for their private griefs to subside. Anne had not chosen a side in the emotional sense. She had chosen the side of the institution, and in that, she had dealt the final blow to Camilla's expectations. Charles turned back to the table, his hand resting on the final page of the document that would seal the fate of his wife's public influence. He read the text over once more, his lips moving silently as he processed the implications of every carefully curated sentence. He began to annotate the text, his pen scratching against the paper with a sound that felt like thunder in the silence of the room. He modified the language, stripping away the brutal bluntness that suggested a formal demotion, replacing it with a wider, more nebulous rule. The new text stated that whenever the workload of the sovereign required additional support, the Prince and Princess of Wales would assume primary responsibility for the public program of the royal family. It was a masterpiece of bureaucratic obfuscation. On the surface, it sounded neutral, almost helpful, yet the result was a functional total transfer of power. Camilla watched as he signed his name, the ink blooming into the parchment with a finality that made her knees weaken. Her name would remain on the stationery, she would keep the titles, and she would stand as the queen, but the vibrant, beating heart of the royal mission was being surgically removed from her reach. As she watched the pen leave the paper, she understood that this was not a compromise. It was a surrender. The power had effectively been handed over to the Wales office before the ink had even dried. She realized that she would no longer be the one shaping the narrative of the monarchy. Nor would she be the one guiding the charitable and diplomatic initiatives that had defined her recent years. The king had placed his signature on a document that essentially promised his son that the transition had begun. He had done his duty to the crown, but in the process, he had diminished the woman who had fought to stand beside him. The betrayal was not in a malicious act. It was in the cold, efficient necessity of the decision, leaving Camilla to stand in the room and watch as the life she had built was slowly, quietly, and irrevocably partitioned away from her. The consequences of the signed document began to ripple through the palace with a speed that suggested the machinery of the institution had been waiting for this exact moment. Before the sun had fully set upon Windsor, the public statement was finalized, its language crafted with the chilling precision of those who had learned how to make a complete transfer of power sound like a simple, necessary balancing act. Camilla was permitted to review the text, but it was a gesture of formality, not consultation. The decision was absolute, and the document lay before her like a tombstone for her public influence. The final lines of the statement articulated clearly that the Prince and Princess of Wales would assume primary responsibility for the public program of the royal family whenever the king reduced his schedule. It was the end of an era, and for those who had lived in the orbit of the throne, the silence that followed the announcement was the loudest sound of all. By the following morning, the administrative reality of the new order became visible. The planners of state visits were already redirecting their briefings to the office of the Wallaces. Charitable organizations that had relied on the Queen for years were suddenly receiving updated contact lists, directing them toward the team that was now defining the future of the house. The international task forces. There was no dramatic spectacle, no explosive headlines to mark the transition in the public eye, but the deep internal currents of royal life had shifted course. Camilla remained queen. Her patronage roles would continue in a reduced capacity, and she would stand beside her husband during the ceremonial events of the state. But the influence that had once been the lifeblood of her position had evaporated. The first public sign of this transition appeared during a state reception scheduled for the following week. Camilla had expected to preside over the evening alongside the king, as she had done for years. Instead, she watched from the periphery as Catherine walked into the room, leading the proceedings with a grace and a professional precision that left no room for doubt about who now held the attention of the state. Catherine navigated the hall, engaging with diplomats, charity leaders, and high-ranking officials as though the responsibility had always been hers. William followed a few paces behind, his eyes constantly tracking the room, not with the look of a participant, but with the focused intensity of a partner who knew exactly what they had achieved. Charles arrived later, a shadow of the monarch he was supposed to be, while the absence of the Queen was noted by the guests with a curiosity that no one dared voice aloud. The optics were catastrophic for Camilla's standing, yet they were perfect for the narrative William had been constructing. The photographs of the evening flooded the digital space within hours. Catherine stood at the center of every frame, the focus of the lens, while William looked on with a sense of quiet, tactical satisfaction. The absence of Camilla became a focal point of intense analysis for the royal commentators who were already beginning to decode the new power structure. Palace aides offered the standard, sanitized explanations that the Queen had chosen to rest. But the public, now primed by the subtle shifts in coverage, looked past the official excuses. Camilla watched the news from the privacy of her own quarters, witnessing the rise of a new center of gravity. She saw the headlines that lauded the confidence of the Princess of Wales, the way the guests leaned in toward her as she spoke, and the effortless way the public seemed to have embraced this transition as if it were the most natural evolution in the world. The pain of it was not in the chaos, but in the efficiency. Everything had gone exactly as William had predicted. That evening, Charles came to her, his attempts to separate the institution from their personal life failing to bridge the chasm that had opened between them. He told her that her titles, her schedule, and the fleeting attention of the public could not define the meaning they held for one another. Camilla listened, her face a mask of regal composure, before she delivered the response he most feared. She told him that she had not spent decades clawing her way to the center of royal life only to be told that the center itself no longer mattered. She reminded him that a title without the power to shape the future was nothing more than an empty relic. Charles had no answer for her. The silence that settled between them was not a silence born of anger, but one of profound, cold comprehension. The following morning, the final fragment of the old order crumbled. A confidential briefing regarding the upcoming Commonwealth meetings was delivered to the office of the Prince of Wales, bypassing the Queen's own correspondence team entirely. The administrative order was so small, so granular, that it could be dismissed as a minor clerical error, but everyone within the palace recognized the truth. The orders had changed. The palace had fundamentally reoriented itself. And Camilla, the woman who had once navigated the most difficult waters in the history of the modern monarchy, was left to stand on the shore, watching as the ship sailed toward a horizon that she had helped build, but would no longer be permitted to navigate. The transition was complete, the institution had secured its future, and the price of that security was the erasure of the woman who had sought only a place at the heart of the crown.